John, turn it over to you.
This morning we're going to take up a timely issue, given the state of the country we live in right now. We're going to talk about violence. And we're going to talk about what the Bible has to say about violence, and is violence ever justified for Christians? And I'm going to say at the outset, the answer to that question has varied throughout the history of the church. But we want to take it up in three different situations. I have a handout if you want to follow. I'm going to be departing from it because it was already too long, so there's some things that I'm talking about that aren't in there. But basically, there are three different situations to talk about. First is participation in war, the use of police power, and then self-defense. But if you have the handout, there's something I want to talk about that's critically important for us to understand when we read the New Testament. And it is about population. The Roman Empire at the end of the first century had about that's a mistake. It says 80, had 60 million people. Yeah, it's there, first sentence. That's a lot of people. But what I'm talking about is the Roman Empire that stretches at this period from Spain up into what is now France and Germany, but not all the way, because they had never actually conquered all those barbarians, over into Greece and Asia Minor, and down into North Africa. And so specifically Egypt, what's now Algeria, some places, they became very important centers for Christianity, certainly by the end of the first century, and in some ways dominated by the end of the fourth century. So how many Christians do you think there were at the end of the first century, around 100? We tend to think of this rapid growth of Christianity, and there were just Christians everywhere. It's estimated there were between 7,500 and 10,000 total in the Roman Empire. That's a very small number. Remember, we're only talking about the Roman Empire, because when the persecutions became intense early on, Christians left Jerusalem and Judea. They did not all stay in the, quote, Roman Empire. Many of them went west beyond Syria into what Damascus and what is now Syria, and down into Arabia, and down into as far as India, where the Apostle Thomas was martyred after starting a church there. So the Christians spread throughout the world, not just in Rome. And also through, between the death of Jesus, the Pentecost Day, and the end of the century, it's 70-odd years, there were a number of brutal persecutions. And Christianity was so small that it could devastate whole communities in towns and cities. By the way, Christianity now is very much a rural religion. In those days, it was almost exclusively urban, found in the cities. So it was easy to get these people. That is why by the end of this century, we say, well, there were 5,000 converted on Pentecost. Well, not all of them stayed, and some of them died, and the church from very on had to deal with people who, in the face of persecution, abandoned the faith. So that's why there are only 7,500 to 10,000 in the Roman world at the end of the first century, and these numbers are based on a really nice study done by Robert Stark of Baylor University. He used all kinds of records and so forth and projections, and these probably are pretty believable numbers. So what does that mean? Well, I'm not going to quote the scriptures because we don't have time really for this, but if you look in 1 Peter, you're going to see that 1 Peter is all about Christians being invisible. What he's really saying to them is keep your heads down. Don't do anything that would call attention to us and make it appear that we were trying to, he uses the term upset the whole world. That is why he says what he does about husbands and wives. That's what he says about slaves. That's why he's adamant that we can't change things because there's not very many of us in a country of, or a nation or empire of 60 million people. At this point, we're talking about there's about 5,000 of them. So, you know, the only thing we can do is die. So let's keep our heads down, right? So as Christianity grows, it grows on an average of 40% per decade. Those are the accepted numbers. So by AD 200, there are 200,000. By AD 300, when Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Milan in 313, after he becomes co-emperor, he does not make Christianity the legal religion. He doesn't even make it legal. People say, well, he established Christianity. No, he didn't. What he did was make it not illegal. He was very careful in his choice of words, right? Because the pagans were still in control, and there were estimated to be about 6 million Christians by then in a country by then of 65 to 75 million, roughly 10%. Why am I talking about this with regard to violence? It has everything to do with it. So in the world of Peter and in the early church, the Christians do not respond with violence to anything. Now, they can't not be arrested if their neighbors point them out. They don't have the ability to fight. They're a tiny little minority. And so people say, wow, they willingly went to the Colosseum. Well, they didn't actually have much of a choice, right, when the persecutions came. The only choice was to abandon the faith, take an oath of allegiance to the emperor worship, that sort of thing, or die. So what develops in the Christian world is a strong pacifism after the death of the apostles, because I'm going to look at some passages here. The church becomes more and more committed to pacifism. They do not want, of course, any personal violence. They do not want you to serve in the army, and they do not want you to become policemen. And yes, in those days, but what we're talking about, there were established police forces. So they become pacific. That is, they say no violence under any circumstances, and no, you may not go to war. But what happens to change that? In 350, there's about 30 million Christians, and it's expected that it probably double by, or more than double by AD 400. There were probably more than half the Roman Empire was Christian. Now the reason for that is not force. It's just simply that these people have become much more sophisticated, and believing on a bunch of gods that look like us, had sex, had more gods, and all lived on one big mountain was silly to them. And so there were people who kept up the old religions, but for the most part, Christianity had become not only a more gentle religion, but a rational religion that didn't seem so silly. So Christianity begins to take over simply because it's the preferred belief. So what changes with regard to violence? Because the whole thing turns upside down around the year 400 when Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, which is in North Africa, writes a treatise on just war theory. And just war theory is, it says very briefly, that not only are you allowed to fight for defense of your country, defense from invasion, or to invade someplace else if horrific things are happening to somebody else, you can go rescue them. Not only are you allowed to do that, if it's a just war called by the emperor, you cannot refuse to go. You have to. So we go from you can't engage in violence to you have to go if certain conditions are met. And then we're not going to go with just war theories really long. You can look it up on the internet if you want, because it's undergone a lot of revisions in roughly 1,600 years. But the idea is then you must be, what, a good soldier. You can't abuse your authority. You need to take whatever precautions you can not to kill civilians. All of this stuff goes back to Augustine. But why the shift from complete pacifism beginning around year 100 and for 300 years, and now, if there's a war you have to go, what's the shift? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Part of the scope. Part of the scope. Originally, it was like, okay, they're coming after me because of my faith in Christ. I can be martyred.
Right.
That's a high call.
Right.
However, scope of national entity or whatnot is a different thing. They're no longer coming after me personally. They're coming after the greater common.
Exactly. That's what happens. So for people who are at home who can't hear, it's a question of scope. Early on, it was a question of my own life, and I can choose to be martyred if I want. But now the scope changes. It's about a whole nation being under assault. And the reason for that change is simply this. If you look at the numbers, that's why I gave them to you. If there are less than 10,000 Christians, you have no power at all. And you can afford to have a standing army made up of pagans who protect you. What happens when you become the majority? Okay, now we're attacked. All the Christians are going to stay home and get overrun. Doesn't work, right? So now, as Christianity becomes more established as the dominant, even by 380, the official religion, you got to figure out how to protect the state. And they were constantly under invasions. Because the Parthians in the west, the barbarians in the north. Who's going to fight if the Christians all stay home? And so now Christianity has to deal with how do we justify violence and war and change our position. I want to suggest to you they go back to the Old Testament. And if on the handout, Numbers 26 in verse 2, where Moses is instructed to take a census of all the congregation of the people of Israel, 20 years old and upward by their fathers' houses, all in Israel who are able to go to war. Israel does not have a standing army. So when they're attacked and they have to fight back, or in this case, they're going into the promised land, they're going to have to fight, it's a general draft, 18 and older. Now you notice there's no up to. And the reason is simple. This is 3,500 years ago, right? People didn't live all that long, and lots of people by the time they were in their 30s and 40s were what? They were old people and unable to participate. So the criteria is at least 18, but you must be physically able to go to war. But do you have to? And the answer is not all people, because if you go down to the next quotation, Deuteronomy 20 in verse 1, I'll read it again. When you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And when you draw near to battle, the priest shall come forward and speak to the people and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near for battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint. Do not fear or panic or be in dread of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you the victory. In other words, these are holy wars. Not just the conquest of Canaan, but when you've got to go, even later in the time of David and so forth, to fight the Philistines who are invading, they're to understand the protection of Israel is a holy war, and therefore justified. So, to read on, then the officers shall speak to the people, saying, Is there any man who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his house. lest he die in the battle and another man dedicate it. And is there any man who has planted a vineyard and has not enjoyed its fruit? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man enjoy its fruit. Is there any man who is betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go back to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man take her. And the officers shall speak further to the people and say, is there any fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own. So, there are exemptions to having to go to war. Why? It has to do with, in Israel, the tribal idea of the line going on, inheritance going on, staying with the original family. If that's in danger, you don't have to go to war. It's also considered cruel to take a newly married person away from his wife and send him off to battle. But everybody else, unless you're too afraid to go, and the reason for that is given, because fear is infectious, you got to go. And I doubt that there were very many people, I just have to say, who spoke up and said, hi, my name's John, and I'm afraid to go. I mean, in the sort of macho culture they had, you just kept your mouth shut and went. Right.
So you could not be a conscientious objector?
No, because God is demanding war. And so to be, there is no conscience that goes against God and his true conscience. So, that's the Old Testament. And that idea holds true and reigns from the days of Moses to John the Baptist. And the Israelites fight many wars, and as I said, they don't have a standing army. It's conscription, right? But by the time we get into the Hellenistic period, we get into the time of the Greek and then Roman domination, there are standing armies in Israel. And so can you be a part of it? Well, in Luke chapter 3 and verse 14, John the Baptist's direction to soldiers. He's baptizing people. The sinners are asking him what to do. Soldiers come to him and say, and we, what shall we do? And he said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages. Notice the one thing he does not say is don't kill anybody. What he says is you can be a good Jewish follower of God and be a soldier if, what? Again, you don't abuse your power. If you do what you're told, well, what are you told to do? You kill people, right? But that's in the service of the state. And so you're allowed to do that as an individual as long, by the way, as this just war theory is met. Even before Augustine, some 400 years later, people were not to engage in abusive things, including unjust wars. Augustine just puts it out there for us to read. So, what about the other New Testament passages? It's interesting that in Acts 10 and 22 and following, the very first Gentile Christian is what? A centurion, which is not only is a soldier, he's an officer and commander, and not only does he engage in battle, he orders others to. And if you read that story carefully, he goes right on being a what? A centurion. So this is enough for war theory, except to say something about Baptists. And that is, the Baptist movement was founded in about 1608, when a group of English separatists, they were called, facing persecution in England, got on a ship and went to the Netherlands. Right? There was a split there. About half the people under John Smith wanted to become the Reformed, which is the equivalent of Presbyterians. The others said, no, no, we want a stricter biblical interpretation of the church, got on a ship and went back to England, and around 1611 or so founded the first real Baptist church in the world. Right. What's that have to do with violence? They were persecuted mercilessly by the English church, but they grew and grew and grew. And so in the 1640s, a Presbyterian named Oliver Cromwell started a revolutionary movement that turned into a full-fledged revolt, and he conquered not only England, and it became its, quote, Lord Protector, he also conquered Ireland. What's that have to do with us and where it happened? A very large part of his army were Baptist, because he was fighting to overturn a king and a religious structure that persecuted them. So from the very beginning, Baptists were in the army and a large part of it. And after the war, they were treated very well by Cromwell during his 40-year rule. Why? Because they'd gone to war for him. And since then, Baptists have had a history of participation in the military and military affairs. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
How come you didn't mention David? He seemed to go to war.
Well, yeah, I mean, thank you. How come I didn't mention David? I could talk about Joshua leading the people, David as a warrior. And thank you for bringing it up, and I'll say something, man, and on and on and on. So we just picked sort of the legal part of it. However, David's an interesting example because under the rules of warfare, you have to be at least 18. And one of the reasons they're quick to point out that he was just a lad is because he was what? Wasn't old enough to go to war. That's why they left him home. So he starts early. You know, it's like during World War II, a lot of people lied about their age because they were too young to join the Marines, but did anyway. And so David kind of fits that model, right? So what about justice in police and militia and maintaining civil order? I'm just going to quote one passage, we could talk about it. It's Romans 13 and verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Remember, 1 Peter is all about this. Right? Be good and keep your head down. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Paul is saying that police forces are part of the governmental structure instituted by God, and the magistrate has every right to use violence against you if you commit that kind of crime. Now, this was written when one of the most brutal emperors in the entire history of the Roman Empire was on the throne, Emperor Nero. So Paul is not saying every ruler is what? Really a good guy. He's saying that government per se is instituted by God. Police powers belong to that because God is ultimately in charge and dictates what is good for society. The police just what? They act in his stead on the earth. So, the Bible does not forbid warfare for or being a soldier, Old or New Testament. It's going to be a matter of individual conscience for people because we're going to get into two critical passages here that deal with violence in general. The Bible enjoins obedience to civil authority and grants civil authority what? Police power. So in terms, you could have a great deal of anxiety or even problems with your local police force. That's not what we're talking about here. But we're talking about in general, you can, as certainly a Baptist Christian, be in the military or go down to the academy and become a Fairfax County police officer. And you are not violating Scripture. Anybody want to comment on that? Those are the easy ones. Go ahead.
How about the government is against God?
Government cannot be against.
If you read the book of Daniel, that is talking about Daniel chapter 11.
Right.
It talks about the last day of the saints.
Mm-hmm.
It says about saints resisted against the force, which implication to your body to have like mark a beast or have like a Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian king, forced to bow down to the statue. But Daniel didn't obey.
That's not what we're talking about. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So she asked in Daniel, actually it's Daniel 7 and Daniel 11, other places about what if you have an evil government? I remind you that one of the most evil rulers, at least in the history of the early world, was Nero. And Paul is saying explicitly, obey the laws. Why? Because unless you have to bow down to an idol, there are almost no laws that require you to break God's laws. Almost, just one second, almost none. Laws against murder, laws against theft, all sorts of laws, they don't have anything to do with violating God's laws. Even somebody asked me about, well, what about abortion? No law in this country for the past 48 years has required you to get an abortion. You choose. Right? So most laws don't require you to violate God's laws. They may allow you to without punishment, but they don't require you to. And you brought up a good point, and in the days of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, that in fact they required them to bow down to idols, but that's a different story. That is you have to choose between your faith and a government-sponsored religion, which is not either Jewish or Christian. That's a different story, I think.
Think Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
The laws at some point required, if you knew about a Jew, to denounce that person to the police. And there were people who were hiding Jews. If they found them, they were violating their law. They used to be prosecuted and went to jail.
Right.
Do we have the same thing in Italy for some time? Similar things happened in America at the time of slavery, when if a slave escaped, people had in certain states and certain times the duty to report them. Now, in this case, a Christian cannot abide the law.
Absolutely. We're not arguing that. We're talking about violence here in the cause of justice. And that Paul says that government and laws are instituted by God. And the kinds of things you're talking about are extraordinarily rare all over the world. When I was visiting China a few years ago and we spoke to Chinese pastors, they said, we are not allowed to preach, anything subversive to the government. But we can preach anything we want about the deity of Jesus, about God's plan of salvation, all the things we hear all the time. So even in an oppressive rule, you can obey all the laws and not violate God's laws. You really can. Now, in the case of Hitler or Mussolini, you have, in my opinion, a satanic rule. And that's a different story. Right? But go ahead.
Paul in his third verse sort of gives the beginning of a measure of when does it cross the line.
Right.
For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but bad.
Right.
Once rulers become a terror to good conduct, it sounds like you've shifted into another mode, and okay, well, that's a different thing.
That's a different thing. But as I want to point out, through most of history, at least after Constantine, in Christian countries, in fact, the government has not been against the Christian church. Even in Muslim countries for centuries, you could be a Christian. You were restricted in some of the things you could do, but you could be a Christian. Now that all changed in, well, several times, but mostly by the end of the 19th century, millions of Christians were martyred in Central Asia, et cetera, right? And
Did I hear you correctly? You're saying that the governments have never been against.
I said for the most part.
But it's satanic rule.
Well,
did I catch that correctly?
there are certain, there are certain people who've ruled who are so outrageously evil, like Hitler, like Mussolini. That those are unusual in the history of the world. They really are. Now, we've had arrogant leaders, we've had leaders who wanted to conquer their neighbors and so forth, but that kind of profound evil is very rare in the history of the world. Mostly, people who live in a country, if they obey the laws, are left alone. And that's what Paul is saying in an evil, brutal kingdom. It would be much different if Paul had written those words when when Constantine was emperor, or Theodosius I, who essentially made, at least de facto, Christianity the religion of the empire. But he did write in those days. He wrote under Nero. And so we need to be careful here about, well, if it's a bad ruler, Paul is writing with, under one of the worst in history, and is saying, no, you need to obey the laws. And if you do, they will leave you alone. And so, but to get back to today's topic, the issue really is about police power. And in most of those cases, the police power is directed at whom? People who break the law. That's exactly what Paul is saying here in this Romans 13, is saying the same thing that Peter is saying in 1 Peter, keep your head down, don't break the law. Don't go out of your way to call attention to yourself because you're a lawbreaker or scoff law, because you need to live at peace with your neighbors. But he does directly and without ambiguity give the government police powers. Go ahead. Anybody else before we move on? Yeah.
I think that this is very important argument because we are living today is different from when people said right is right, wrong is wrong, morally. But today we are living is all fallen. And I believe that the book of Revelation and book of Daniel, it talks about the last day of the government, which enforce you to have receive all the marks, what they're calling the mark of the beast.
Right.
And so many things against God. So the last day of saints are like soldiers. They resisted, and they even until die, they resisted against that force.
Right, but see, we're not saying different things here.
Yeah.
You're making a point that government could be evil, and I'm saying absolutely yes.
Yes.
Government can make fun of God and not like God. I'm saying absolutely yes. But what I'm saying is Paul leaves you no room to break the law. He just doesn't.
Yes. Yeah. I understand.
He can't.
Yeah, I agree
Right.
with that.
And so we just need to be aware of that. And we live in a country like no other in the history of the earth. Now we have to move into personal violence here, which allows us a role in governance that's hardly been seen since the first people got together in a little village. We get to vote. We get to choose. And oftentimes the person or the government we want, we don't have. You know, because the other side won. But the point is we get to participate in that. And through almost all human history, people haven't. The rulership is either inherited or seized. And so we live in a different country here, and a different kind of environment. But let's move on now, if you will, to personal violence. And there are a couple of passages I want to take up. Two I didn't actually write down because I wasn't sure they were necessary when we use these others. I'm going to mention them very quickly. I just jotted them down here. The first is Exodus 20 and verse 13, which is the well-known 10 Commandments that the commandment says what? You said thou shalt not kill. Somebody else said thou shalt not murder. Which is it? Both. In the King James Bible, it says thou shalt not kill. Subsequent translations have said thou shalt not murder. Why the shift? Briefly, the Hebrew word is ratzah, and it means the taking of a human life by one person taking the other. It can be used for murder. It basically means kill, which is why the King James did kill. However, if you go on reading in Exodus or in Leviticus or in Deuteronomy, the people are required to kill people. So how can it mean thou shalt not kill if you're required to kill people? Not just in war, right? And we're going to talk about one at the very end of this. And so the sense is thou shalt not murder. That's why modern English translations have thou shalt not murder and not thou shalt not kill, because it is too broad. It would seem to indicate there's never a point when you can kill somebody, when in fact, in the Old Testament, you had to. Let me see, what was the other one? Okay, I'm going to skip that. So, now let's get to, what's the most important passage to you in dealing with violence in the New Testament? Does anybody have thought about this? What have you struggled with the commands of Jesus or Paul? The one that's most widely used is in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says what? If someone slaps you on a cheek, do not respond, turn the other cheek. That has been used a lot to say we cannot engage in violence at all. And no matter what happens, you must refrain from violence. Does that make sense to you? That's the passage, by the way, that was used by the early Christians so that you couldn't serve in the army and they were completely pacifist. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to disturb, but I think this is very important because so many believers thinking like we should be good at not using violence. I agree with that. But what we know of Jesus Christ, also he said, love your enemies, and when somebody beat you here, you give another cheeks. But also same Jesus, he made, before he died in Jerusalem, before enter the temple, he made a whip, and he went to the temple of God, and he started, what he did was amazing. He turned over the table, and he beat the people, and threw the, that's...
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point, because Jesus himself resorts to violence. And by the way, there are several passages in the New Testament, in your NIVs and your ESVs, and New Revised Standard, if you have it, that said Jesus was deeply troubled in spirit. The underlying Greek is Jesus was gut-wrenchingly mad. But the point that is that we've softened Jesus. You see, Jesus is the huge teddy bear they used to have in, I've said this before, in New York, in Schwartz, FAO Schwartz or whatever. Oh, we need to just go up and hug the big Jesus, right? That's not the Jesus of the New Testament. The Jesus of the New Testament gets mad. The Jesus of the New Testament gets violent. So what are we to do with this? If somebody strikes you on the cheek, turn the other one. Go ahead.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that. But one, it seems to me Jesus, when he came in, most of the time he was defending God. It was not for himself. It was, and, so, and he also came to teach us. This is not what you do in God's temple. It's not how you treat each other.
Mm-hmm. That's the point. He was defending God in Christian worship. But remember that he is what? God. Go ahead.
I don't want to get into a long conversation, but the thing that keeps striking me over everything you're talking about is when I think of someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, he was such a pacifist. He did not believe in violence, but ended up before he died becoming part of a group that was aimed to assassinate Hitler.
To assassinate Hitler.
Here he was, how are we going to prevent all these other people from dying? So, I think, when I hear what you just said about Jesus, and then I think of someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think about someone who loves people and believes in justice.
Right. Jesus believes in justice, like men and women like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who are pacifists, at some point have to figure out if they've got to take action against profound evil, and they decide that killing is worth it. Let's go back to this passage, and if you have the notes, I want to draw your attention to two Greek words that I have printed from a Greek dictionary, Strong's numbers, right? Rapizo. A rod or stick, which is from rabados, a stick or wand, to beat with rods. Later in the New Testament, or by the time of the New Testament, it doesn't mean that anymore. What it means is to slap with the open hand. We're talking about a what? Somebody slaps you, maybe even a backhand. Jesus has just talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemy, and do not what? Take revenge. Leave revenge to God. So what is the significance of a rapizo? Because if you look below it, I've included another word, which is the Greek New Testament word for a real blow. So that is kalaphizo, and that means to strike with the fist. That's a hard hit. So what's the point of the slap here? What are we talking about? Throughout history. No, throughout history, what is this? When one man slaps another man, what's it mean? It's a huge indignity. It is an insult. It is what? A challenge for you to fight back. And so Jesus is saying, don't. Just step back. We're not talking about somebody who attacks you with a knife or a gun or with fist or rod to kill you. We're talking about somebody who what? Gives you one of the grossest insults one man could give another in the first century. And he's saying, suck it up, take it.
I was reading an article, I think I got into that, when Will Smith slapped the other comedian.
Right.
For the whole world to see. The other comedian did not quickly come back on him. He was shocked.
Right.
And so the Academy and everyone else punished Will Smith for what he did. And the other comedian just let it go.
Let it go. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about an attack where you can't defend yourself. We're talking about a slap. We're talking about an insult. We're talking about something much less. And we're going to get into the defense now. Go ahead, please.
And it seems to be sort of a differentiation as well between whether you're going to respond sort of from pride or or whether you're going to respond to an oppression that's coming at you that will be directed at others if you don't respond.
Well, that is true. We're talking about a real insult that can spread. And the question is, what is going to be your part in it? And there's I'll get you 1 second. There's a psalm, Psalm 4, verse 4. It's repeated in Ephesians 4th chapter. And it says, be angry, but commune with your own heart in your bed. And Paul writes it, be angry, but sin not and give no excuse to the devil. What he's saying is this: you can't not be angry. It is not possible. It's biblical, and it's also physiologically, because when you sense a threat, whether it's verbal or physical or whatever, this little tiny part of your brain, right at the top of the spinal cord, they call it the lizard brain for a reason, because we share it with lizards, fires before you think about it. And when that little tiny organ fires, it floods your body with what? Hormones that jack you up. So Paul is not saying anything that Jesus is not saying. What he's saying is, okay, take the time to what? Let your forebrain actually engage and think about this before you strike back.
But it is possible to respond to violence with violence in meekness.
Okay, yes.
We're not called to weakness, we're called to meekness, to be self-controlled.
Right, we're called to be self-controlled, to respond meekly. So what else does Jesus say about violence? Because there's another passage that's often used to say you can never respond. And that is when, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when, let me find that passage real quick here. And I'm going to read it for you. When Jesus is about to be arrested, the cohort comes, actually the police, the equivalent of police. They surround Jesus. And beginning in chapter 22, verse 49, it reads this way: and when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus says, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed it. And then he goes on to say what? Does anybody remember? Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So it seems to forbid what? Violence. Is that what's happening here? I maintain no, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. Maintain that Jesus must die. And defending him is the wrong thing to do, because he's already told them, I must what? I must suffer and be raised on the third day. We can't do this. Everybody stop. And then he goes what? Meekly with them. This is not a general prohibition against using a sword, because you have to ask yourself, the question was, shall we strike with the sword? And then we do know from, I think, Matthew that Peter does. Where'd the sword come from?
Well, I guess they all had swords or little knives or longer knives or something.
Not all of them, but let's go to Luke 22 and verse 35, same chapter, back it up. We're in the upper room now. We have not gone to Gethsemane. And he said to them, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? They said nothing. He said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that the scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, Lord, Lord, we have 2 swords. And he said to them, it's enough. Who has the swords? We know one, Peter. Right? He has to, because he cuts Malchus' ear off, right? Who has the other one? There were two Simons, Simon Peter, Simon Zelotes, probably Simon Zelotes because Simon the Zealot, Zealots were looking for a military uprising to drive the Romans out. The two Simons have a sword. What kind of sword? A Machaira, which is about anywhere from 18 to 30 inches, double-edged with almost a stiletto point. It's designed for stabbing to death. The Zealots carried those and often assassinated people in the marketplace. And so using that word, it is likely that what? They were carrying assassin swords. But that was the common sword that was carried by people because they wore two garments. They wore a tunic, and over it they wore a cloak. And guess what you could do with the Machaira? You could put it on your hip underneath your cloak. It was concealed carry. You know. So why does Jesus tell them, we need to quit here, but why does Jesus tell them to go buy swords and take them? When he told them earlier, just rely on God and don't take them. It's situational. When Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2, he says to them, do not take the road to the Gentiles and do not go to Samaria, but go what? Only to the house of Israel. And there they would be what? Safe. God can take care of them. You don't need to, God's going to do everything for you. You need to learn to depend on God. Now we are at the point of the death of Jesus, the founding of the church. These 11 left are going to have to be the bold takers of this into the world. And so what is he saying to them? It's really dangerous out there. You're not going to the house of Israel anymore. You're not going to your brothers and sisters. You're going on lonely, dangerous roads. You need to take a sword. You need to take care of yourself. That's the difference he's saying here. We need to be careful about saying the Bible says don't use violence. The Bible says from first to last, use it only in what? Defense of the good. So one last thing. There's a Jewish Mishnah on this. It's called the Law of the Rodef, and it's the pursuer law. If I see somebody pursuing them to do harm, the Rodef, I must intervene even if it means killing the Rodef, because I have to save you, right? And I'm not, by the way, given the alternative of just standing by and watching. I have to take action. Because we are required, and this is carried over at many of Jesus' statements about the poor and the weak, we're required to take care of them. And so we're ending now, but any last questions? But I just want to summarize. The Bible permits Old and New Testament service in the military and in police forces. It also, I believe, at least does not deny the right to self-defense. But you must always do what? If you take Paul seriously, try to avoid it. It's a last resort for people, right? Go ahead.
I'm just thinking to be more realistic in the common world right now is, you know, our poor children, and of course mine are also out, but the kids at school, every single day somebody's bullied. Every day.
Yes.
If not every hour. And the guy that's bullied is usually the guy that's not very macho. And so the bullier can take advantage of the person. So what do you take? I mean, as a father, I didn't have a boy, but you know, girls are bullied too, and it's horrible. But how do you tell your child how to keep that from happening? And you would think, well, punch him back or do something to defend yourself, and they'll stop. And all of a sudden they go, oh my God, I guess I'm bullying the wrong guy. So what can you do?
The question of bullying is a big one, but I would suggest that the emphasis now on recognizing bullying is only acknowledging what's been going on since people were first came together, because when I was a kid,
Teach
bullying was bullying was rampant in schools. When you know, in the 1950s. So yeah, go ahead. We're through here, but if you want to continue, that's fine.